Okay, we will get started. Tonight, by the way, because my schedule all got confused, I would have talked about this last week and other things. Tonight is a celebration of Israel's Independence Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut. Now, actually, the date should be this coming Shabbat, but because of the festivities and everything that surrounded, when it would fall on Shabbat, they move it up a few days, move it to Thursday, Wednesday night, Thursday, so that Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers of Israel, takes place on Wednesday, and then the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations start Wednesday night, going into Thursday. So we, of course, we have a session in which we'll talk about Zionism, the creation state of Israel. That's in a couple of weeks. And also we will talk about the Holocaust, and the Holocaust Memorial was last week as well. So normally I try to do these programs if I can, before the events, but it just got all messed up this year. My apologies. All right, so tonight we're kind of going to go through close to 1,800 years of Jewish history in, 120 minutes or so, give or take. We usually take a break, so 100 minutes. It's just to give you a taste for the general flow of Jewish history. Actually, I was cheating, and I've used partially the timeline for Wikipedia, because I can download it and put it into a format, but I will add stuff to it and I take stuff out of it. But I want to go back to the very beginning, the first century of the Common Era. We're going to start there real quickly because we have talked about that in the past. But know that in that first century, from the year 1, since the century begins with 1, was a very important period of time. We know that the Jewish community was not one unified community. There was a Judean state, or Judean location, that was under Roman rule, approximately, that's the word I was looking for. But there were many different Jewish groups. The most significant ones, according to Josephus, who was writing after the First Jewish-Roman War, suggested you had the society divided into the following groups. You had the Sadducees, representing mostly from the priestly class. They were more conservative, I would say, in some ways, in terms of their attitude towards Jewish law's development. Many associate them with the wealthy class, because that seems to be a part of it. And they probably dominated political and social life up until after the time of the destruction of the temple, since the high priest came usually from their group, and they had control of the temple. They probably had greater control than the rabbis gave them credit for, because the rabbis who descended from the Pharisees, which really is what modern Judaism is a descendant of, was a second group, originally very small, relatively small. They are the authors of Judaism as we know it. And they were opposed to the Sadducees, and there are lots of information in the rabbinic sources about the conflict with the Sadducees. There were sectarians such as the Essenes that Josephus mentioned, and then what he calls the Zealots. The Zealots, he says, basically were the same as the Pharisees, but they were more interested in revolting from Rome. Now, of course, this is his looking back at it, and he has certain axes to grind. He's trying to appease the Roman authorities to a certain extent after the Jewish revolt. And so he wants to lay as much blame as possible on these zealots and remove from any other element in the Jewish world. But there's also another group that the only mention in Josephus is apparently something that was added on later on. Some medieval copyists put it in is a reference to Jesus and his Christian followers. But remember, when Christianity begins, it is really just another group amongst the Jewish gatherings. I don't know how to call it, the Jewish people. We can't know for sure what their earliest beliefs were. It's all lost to the sands of history. The New Testament is written much later than the time of Jesus. Paul never met Jesus, and he has, a very heavy impact on the development of Christianity. But in its earliest days, it saw itself as part of the Jewish world. And one of the major breaks comes when Christianity decides that they are no longer going to demand that Christians, or at least non-Jewish Christians, observe the Torah, specifically the laws of circumcision and the sacrifices, various other things. The real split comes with the destruction of the temple in the year 70. The first Jewish revolt against Rome started in the year 66 of the Common Era. It ends around the year 70. Actually, it even goes a little bit longer than that. And it ended with the destruction of the Second Temple, the fall of Jerusalem. Some sources say as many as over 1 million people were killed by the Romans during the siege, 97,000 captured and enslaved. And the Jewish community of Rome, in part, was built from slaves who eventually were freed in Rome. There were Jewish communities in Rome. We know that. How much there were at that point in time, we can't know. We do know later on, there's mention of people in Rome transmitting letters back and forth to the rabbis in Israel. But with the revolt and the destruction of the temple, that split between Judaism and Christianity really began to spread more. We can't say when it completely splits off, but it certainly does end up being two different religions and two religious bodies. But to be fair and honest, Pharisaic Judaism, which is what we inherit, and the Jewish Christians come from the same era, shared some of the same ideas and some of the same concepts. But of course, the person of Jesus and then later Greek philosophy that enters into the Christian ideas moved it further and further away from Judaism. You might note that up until much later in history, the church decided when Easter was based upon when Jews were going to celebrate Passover. They didn't have their own calculation until the church came up with it. And what the church's calculation essentially is coincides with Passover. It has to be, I think it's the first Sunday after the first Friday, after the full moon of the spring, first full moon is after the spring equinox. Got all of that? That's when Easter falls. And this year it fell during the middle of Passover, is most of the time it does, because that's when Passover falls. But they didn't feel, how can we go to the Jews to find out when Easter is, when we accuse the Jews of killing Jesus? So anyway, so with the destruction of the temple, the rabbinic body begins to become more influential in the Jewish world. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who escapes from Jerusalem during the siege, reestablishes the Sanhedrin, or at least a version of the Sanhedrin in Yavne. And what we have today comes through the hands of the rabbis of Yavne. And so this is also known in some circles as the ages of the Tanaim, the rabbis who compiled the Mishnah, or the rabbis who are mentioned in the Mishnah, though some come earlier than this period. So now, in the 2nd century, and we're going up, as I said, we're going to go relatively quickly here. There's a Jewish community in the land of Israel. There's a Jewish community in Babylonia that had always been there since the destruction of the first temple. And there were Jews spread out around the Mediterranean basin. And interestingly enough, between the year 115 and 117, there was a second Jewish-Roman war. But this was actually conducted by Jews who lived in Cyprus, in what is modern Libya, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, those areas under Roman rule. And it was very bloody, and perhaps ended up with being bloodier than the first Jewish-Roman war. The Jews in the land of Israel did not participate in it. They weren't involved. It was Jews of the, as we would say, of the diaspora. But it ends up with the Emperor Hadrian coming to power, and that he eventually, among other provocations, renames Jerusalem Ilia Capitolina and prohibits circumcision and other Jewish practices, and that gives rise to the Bar Kokhba revolt, Shimon Bar Kokhba. And again, it's a catastrophe for the Jews of the land of Israel. Large numbers were killed, and any sense of Judea being separate and distinct, the Romans attempt to stamp it out, and even they renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina. And the word and usage of the terminology of Palestine comes from this period of time. For the Philistines, Palestina, and that's where Palestinians come from, actually, the terminology. This also, the rabbis of that time were split. Some supported the Bar Kokhba revolt, amongst them famously Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva dies a martyr during that time. Many other rabbis died during the Hadrianic persecutions. And Jews were banned from the city of Jerusalem. And it was a very difficult period of time. Around 138, when Hadrian dies, the Jews were allowed to visit Jerusalem only on Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the destruction of the temples. I don't know if that was to rub it in or what, I don't know. And the Jewish community essentially centers itself in the Galilee for the part of the Jewish community who lived in the land of Israel. Now, we've already mentioned that around the year 100, the Mishnah is edited by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, under the pressures from Roman rule and the coming of, well, Christianity has not yet taken over. Hi, Hayden, how are you? And so, thus the Mishnah comes into being. Whether it's only edited and is left oral, is it written down? That's the scholars argue about back and forth. But with its redaction, somewhere between the year 20 and 225, 200 and 225, there we go. We move over from what is called the age of the Tanaim, the rabbinic age of the Mishnaic period, to the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmudic era. Okay, and so we have relative peace though for a while. Around the year 315 to 337, we're in the 4th century now, the Roman Emperor Constantine I enacts new restrictive legislation. He was the first Christian emperor.
I got water.
I'm sorry? Okay.
I wasn't on mute.
You're talking, I'm not sure what, okay. So he forbids conversion of Christians to Judaism. And you know, we're beginning to see the turnover from the pagan Rome to eventually Christian Rome, and Jews began to associate Rome and Christianity hand in hand. And around the year 358, because of dangers from the Roman persecution, Hillel II establishes the calendar that we use today. Okay? He publishes the basic calculations. We no longer rely upon the Sanhedrin, which in this time was in Tiberias, to proclaim the months and the years and all of that. And from then on, we rely on the calculations that he established in our calendar today, still follows those calculations. And the Sanhedrin as it was ceases to exist. Now, briefly, and this is kind of a little footnote in history, in between 361 and 363, you don't need to remember this, but the last pagan Roman emperor, Julian, who was also called the apostate by the Christians, tries to restore paganism to Roman world, and he allowed the Jews to return to the holy Jerusalem, and even permits them to rebuild the temple. But before that can happen, he's assassinated. End of that story. But there is a hint that maybe sacrifices were offered for a period of time. Then, just like during the Bar Kokhba revolt, they may have been offered in Jerusalem. Another interesting little footnote as we look at Jews throughout the world. All right, so we know that there are Jews in the land of Israel. We know there are Jews scattered around North Africa, Asia Minor, Italy, perhaps Spain even at this time, and even as far as what this day is France. There were Jews in India. All right? So that in 379, again, this is kind of a little footnote history, the Hindu king Sira Primo, also known as Uru Brahman, issued what was engraved on a tablet of brass, his permission to Jews to live freely, build synagogues, own property without conditions attached, as long as the world and moon exist. So this engraving, this tablet apparently was found, and so the Jews of India, it's interesting, there are two still existent Jewish communities in India. One is essentially Jews who are Iraqi in origin, hail from Iraq and moved there at some point in history. But there's a very old community called the Cochin Jews. And the Cochin Jews very clearly had a certain degree of intermarriage with the local population. And the Iraqi Jews have a tendency not to recognize them as really being Jewish. So what else is new? One Jewish group with another. So, there is a community still existing from that period of history going back that far. Now, we don't know for sure when the Jerusalem Talmud is redacted, and some say 350, some say 450, but somewhere in that 100-year span, it seems that the work on the Jerusalem Talmud stops. That's because the schools of Israel had difficulties, the academies there, and when one studies the Talmud, one sees that it's a very poorly edited, it's not as well edited as the Talmud that we call the Babylonian Talmud, because the Babylonian Talmud had another 100 to 150 years, and even after that, additions were added to it, clearly later redaction. So now, Jews are scattered. Jews are scattered in the Arabian Peninsula. There was in modern Yemen, there was a king who converted to Judaism around the year somewhere between 500 and 523. We know that there was a long-living Jewish community in Yemen that was there until recently. I'm not sure. I think there's still a few Jews left in Yemen, but a once flourishing Jewish community, as a result of earlier persecutions and modern issues, has basically disappeared. All right, so now, generally speaking, around the year 550, between 450 and 550, we say is the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud, at least according to a lot of the traditional scholars. Modern scholars recognize that it took a lot longer for its completion. It really has at least another 100 years or so of editing going on during the age of what we call the Sabaraim. This is rabbis who basically what at that time was considered Persia, who put most of the Talmud in its final form, although we do know that even later on, there were various and sundry allusions added or parts added to it. Sometimes, interestingly enough, a commentary which was on the side of it. So, the rabbis wrote comments on the side of the page. Sometimes they got added into the text itself. Something was meant as a translation got entered into the text of the Talmud. So we're creating some strange realities that way. I just wanted to say something. What's it called? I'll be with you a second. Oh yeah, there's a thing called Quora Digest. I don't know if any of you look at Quora Digest. They have asked people answer questions. So somebody asked a question the other day. When was the Talmud edited or last amended or something? So I wrote an answer to that, saying really it's a very complicated issue as to when it really was edited, because they say the scribes in the Middle Ages were not always careful. They made mistakes, and sometimes they changed because they thought this is what it was supposed to be. And some of the scholars suggested emendations. And sometimes they should have been kept on the side as their suggestion, but sometimes they entered into the text. And so when we're studying Talmud, we see the text. We see Rashi says, "This is how this is our version of what it should be." And we look in the text of the Talmud; it's exactly what Rashi said. So we don't have what Rashi was correcting, because somebody came along and corrected it according to Rashi. Okay? We find that frequently. But we do know that there are various manuscripts that differ sometimes significantly in a few places. Mostly they're minor kinds of differences, but occasionally there's a major difference in the text of the Talmud. And that's a result of bad copyists, or a result of somebody emending the text, saying this is what it should be, what have you. Now, if we move along a little bit, as I said, Jews lived in Spain already early. We don't know exactly when. And if you've learned anything about your Roman history and European history, you know that Europe was constantly being invaded, especially after the Roman era, by Goths and Visigoths and this Goth and that Goth. And the Visigoths, for example, got as far as Spain. And there was a Jewish community in Spain. And around 612, the king of the Visigoths forces Jewish subjects to convert to Christianity. There is one suggestion that the Kol Nidre prayer, in which we ask God to forgive us for vows that we couldn't keep in the past year, was originally composed for Jews who swore to be Christians and wanted to secretly practice their Judaism. It's a theory we don't know, but we do know of information of that taking place. Now, the 7th century, of course, brings about the rise of Islam. Muhammad begins in the Arabian Peninsula amongst mostly pagan Arabs. The Quran mentions Jews, sometimes nicely, sometimes not so nicely. There was fighting between some of the tribes that sided with Muhammad and those that were Jewish tribes. But eventually, a lot of the Jewish community was removed or converted as a result of the rise of Islam. And of course, the rise of Islam as it moved throughout the Middle East and then later on through North Africa and all the way up to Spain and then up to the Byzantine Empire. Jews were part of that world. Sometimes they lived very peacefully in it, sometimes not so peacefully. The Rome, for example, even going earlier, the Romans and the Parthians, before the fall of the Roman Empire, before this area fell to the Muslim rule, we know there were cases where Jews who lived in the land of Israel sided with the invaders, the Parthian invaders, because they didn't care for Rome, and may even have opened up the gates to the cities to the Parthian invaders, And when the Romans came back and took over, they took their revenge. So it is clear the Jews who were part of the Roman world didn't necessarily feel like it was where they wanted to be. And so we're not always good, honest citizens without any question. I don't, today, most Jews, I would think, wherever country they live in, they're loyal citizens to that country. But when you have a different kind of world, that may go different ways. So the rise of Islam does impact Judaism, especially later on in Muslim Spain. The introduction or reintroduction to the world of Greek philosophy came through Muslims, through his Arabic translations of the Greek texts. And Jews benefited by that, those who are interested in philosophy. And certainly Jewish philosophy during that time was heavily indebted to Greek philosophy as coming through the Islamic world. And a good portion, a large majority of the Jewish world lived in Islamic lands and mostly spoke Arabic. And that's why later on Maimonides writes a number of his works in Arabic. Other Jewish scholars write their works in Arabic as well as Hebrew. Now, as I said, the Sabarayim are usually referred to as living during the 7th century, the 8th century, up to the 8th century. And around the 8th century, around the year 700, begins what is called, the Jewish historians call the period of the Gaonim. Gaon means excellency. Okay? A Gaon was also the title of the head of the academies that existed at that time, in Baghdad especially. And they were highly influential through the Jewish world because the centers of Jewish scholarship was still in that part of the world. While there were Jewish scholars throughout the Jewish world, the Gaonim and the Gaonic academies were really where people turned to. It was the Harvard or University of Toronto of its day, in that sense. Right? And so they had, when Jews had questions, they turned to the Gaonim, who had relatively free reign by the local authorities. They were not given full-fledged citizenship in the same way. Both Christians and Jews had a lower status. They were sometimes referred to as dhimmi, but they were not necessarily persecuted by the Islamic authorities. They had abilities, but they could also rise very high in the culture. So that was significant, so that the Jews who lived throughout, as I said, the majority lived in the Islamic world, so therefore they turned to the leadership of the Jews in the Islamic world, the Gaonim. And then around 711 is when the Muslims conquer Spain. And once again, Jews and Christians were given a relative degree of freedom of worship and of their lives. And some say the golden age of Spanish Jewry begins here. Some say it's a little bit later on. But according to one of my sources, it says that at this time, Jews made up about 8% of the Spanish population. A large number there. There's another example of a strange political realia. The king of the Khazars around their year 740, I mentioned this when we talked about Yehuda Halevi. He and maybe some of his upper class converted to Judaism, and they're there until they're destroyed by Russian and Byzantine forces around 1016. Now, also at this time, around the year 760, we have the rise of the Karaites. The Karaites was a sect in Judaism. They rejected rabbinic law and rabbinic interpretation. They wanted to live only in accordance with the biblical text. They rejected the prayer services that had been developed. They rejected any of the rabbinic oral laws. And eventually they become separate and distinct from the rest of the Jewish world. Today, there are only a handful of Karaites left in the world. And Hitler didn't make a distinction, by the way. As far as he was concerned, Karaites were Jews. And so they suffered during the Holocaust as well. As I said, most of the time Jews had fair degree of freedom, but sometimes we would have things like in 807, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid orders all the Jews in the caliphate to wear a yellow belt, and Christians had to wear a blue belt. I'm not sure how that goes in terms of karate belts, but that's what to identify them. And it was around 846 that Rav Amram Gaon compiled his Siddur, the first Siddur that became printed and or at least published, as it were. It was handwritten. And we have various sundry issues that sometimes created problems for Jews and Christians who live in the Islamic world. But like I say, it was usually a period of relative calm for Jews. And the 10th century, from about the year 912 in the 10th to 1013, that everybody agrees is the golden age of Spanish Jewish culture. When the Abd al-Rahman III becomes Caliph of Spain in 912, he ushered in really the height of tolerance. Jews and Muslims, Jews and Christians were exempted from military service. They had the right to their own courts of law, had to guarantee the safety of their property. Jewish poets, scholars, scientists, statesmen, and philosophers flourished and were integral part of the extensive Arabicization, especially in Muslim Spain. This is the famous golden age of Spanish Jewry. That ends around the year 1013, when once again Jews have severe restrictions placed upon them. During some of the fighting, during the course of the various episodes, Jews got caught in the middle sometimes between the various Islamic groups and suffered as a result, especially if they picked the wrong side. But sometimes they were also high up in the circles of the ruling class of Muslims at that time, as advisors, as treasurers, as we find later on there were even generals in Islamic armies. Now, while all this is going on in the Islamic world, we know that Jews were active and involved in what was at that time France and Germany, Italy, and England. We have some of the great scholars. We have the Rabbi Meir Or HaGolah, Rabbeinu Gershom, I meant. Rabbeinu Gershom, who was responsible for the ban on polygamy. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And then the most famous rabbi following him in what we call Ashkenazic circles was, of course, Rashi, 1040 through 1105. And he was famous for his commentary on the Bible, on the Torah especially, and on the Talmud. And he was a teacher of a generation of rabbinic figures, especially with his sons-in-law and his grandsons. And eventually his commentary becomes known even in Africa and in Spain, and is mentioned, sometimes favorably, sometimes criticized. What else is known? By the Spanish Jewish commentators. Now, in the year 1090, which becomes important as we during the era of Maimonides, the Rambam, Granada was conquered by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who was the king of the Almoravids. And the Jewish community, which was believed to have sided with the Christians, was destroyed in Granada, and many Jews fled to Christian Toledo. And we have similarly in Europe, in 1095, we begin the Crusades. And the Crusades, which have as their goal reconquering the land of Israel, especially Jerusalem, that was important to them. Many Jews were killed on the way there. After all, if we're going to go kill these Muslim infidels in Jerusalem, why don't we kill the Jewish infidels in our backyard? And so this creates issues for Jews throughout this next couple of hundred years in Europe. If we look to, so during this time, all right, so we said 1095 was when the Crusades began. 1100 or so is when Grashi's grandson says the Tosafot come into being. And we have this Almoravid ruler who expels Moroccan Jews who don't convert to Islam. This is around the year 1107. Maimonides is born in Cordoba in the year 1135. And of course, we can't talk about Judaism without talking about Maimonides, which I've mentioned constantly throughout the lectures. He was, of course, a leading scholar in the Sephardic world. He wrote, of course, the Mishnah Torah, and he wrote that in Hebrew. He wrote in Arabic, philosophical works, Guide for the Perplexed. We know that he and his family fled Spain to northern Africa. It was a result of the Almoravid persecutions, eventually settling in Egypt, where he was able to live a little more peacefully. But he had a tremendous impact, obviously, in the entire Jewish world. In 1190, just talking about some of these points of history, we have a famous episode known as the York Massacre. By York, I don't mean York as in Toronto. I mean York as in York in England. And it was in part a result of the Crusades, part a result of a blood libel. And if you go to York, my wife and I, a number of years ago, had an opportunity to tour around England. I don't advise driving. I came home every day with a headache because I was driving on the wrong side of the road. At least for me, it felt like it. But anyway, they tell the story of what happened. There's a fortress there, which is not the original one, but it was built on a place where the Jews were housed by the local bishop until he gave up and turned the Jews over to the mobs. As we move up to the 13th century, right, we know that we had Jews in England, but in 1240, under King Henry III, some Jews were blamed for counterfeiting money, and the king expelled his Jewish subjects. According to at least some, it was meant to save them from harm. But Jews were legally expelled from England and really don't come back legally until the time of Cromwell. Now, also during this time period, we have the life of Moses de Leon of Spain. And he publishes for the public the Zohar. When we talk about Kabbalah in a few weeks, I'll talk more about the Zohar and the issues around it. But he was the popularizer of the Zohar. He claimed to have just printed it or publicized it, not necessarily printed it, publishing it, but he claimed it was a work that goes back to Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and it becomes a major force for Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and it had its impact even on legal works. Sometimes some of the rabbis decided certain Jewish questions, issues of legality, based upon what the Zohar had to say. And around between the year 1250 to 1550 is what is referred to as the Rishonim. So we have the biblical age. We have the age of the men of the Great Assembly. That ends somewhere around the time of the Tanaim, or before the Tanaim, the authors of the Mishnah. We have the age of the rabbis, the Tanaim, who Mishnah, the Amoraim of the Talmudic era. We have the Sabaraim, who is a generation between the conclusion of the Talmud and the age of the Gaonim. And beginning in 1250, it's usually referred to as the age of the Rishonim, the first scholars, medieval scholars. And most Jews at this period of history lived in lands bordering the Mediterranean Sea or in Western Europe under the various feudal systems. And now with the decline of Muslim and Jewish centers of power, Iraq, there really was no single place in the world which was recognized authority for deciding matters of Jewish law and practice. Thus, the local rabbis wrote commentaries on the Torah and the Talmud and law codes that would allow Jews everywhere to live their lives in accordance with Jewish law. And we clearly have, prior to this, but clearly as the time goes on, not a huge split between Sephardic and Ashkenazic worlds, but you have legal traditions that do go in different directions, as well as customs and practices in the two different communities. Around the year 1270 to 1343, we still have a strong Jewish community in Spain. Rabbeinu Asher, who flees from the north during the Crusades at that time, settles in Spain. And Rabbeinu Asher is recognized as a great authority. And he becomes the dominant authority, even though he's of Ashkenazic background, he becomes the dominant authority in the Sephardic Spanish Jewish world. One of his sons, Jacob ben Asher, writes what is called the Arba Turim, or the four pillars, four rows of Jewish law, which is the basis with the Shulchan Aruch later on, follows that same pattern, chapter headings and things like that. And instead of following Maimonides, we talked about this before, Maimonides covering the entire gamut of Jewish law and tradition, he centered his works on those aspects of Jewish law and traditions that were applicable in day and age. So we didn't talk about sacrifices, didn't talk about the laws of kings, but he talked about the laws of kashrut, or marriage, or prayer, Torah, things like that. Now, I said that Jews had been expelled from England in 1250, but apparently not 1250, what did I say, 1240. But apparently not all the Jews always obey the local laws. So there apparently were still a few hanging around. And in 1290, Edward I issued, there was a statute, 1275 statute of Jewry, which totally forbade Jews to live there. So even though some were hanging around, now they were officially expelled for sure. During the 14th century, it was Jews never knew in Europe, never could be sure what was going to be happening in their hometowns. Europe had various local powers. The local powers had greater authority usually than the king. He may have over everybody, but they had local power. And Jews were sometimes accepted to live in certain areas, and sometimes they were expelled in other areas. Sometimes they would pay a kind of a bribery that would get them back in good graces. And sometimes they would then be expelled again. Sometimes Jews would say, all right, no Jew is allowed to live in this city without us Jews permitting it, because Jews had been expelled. And these kinds of things go on for the next few centuries in Europe and in Germany and in France. And it's in the year 1343 that the Jews of Western Europe were invited by Casimir the Great, the King of Poland, to come to Poland, to settle in Poland. Now, a lot of Poland at this time was relatively empty, and a lot of Germans moved to Poland as well, and a lot of Jews did. And now, when the Jews moved to Poland and other places in Eastern Europe, many of them, most of them, had been speaking German with some Hebrew thrown into it. But in Poland, where the local language was Polish, while some Jews did indeed learn Polish, they also kept alive this Judeo-German dialect, which became Yiddish. And so it was written in Hebrew letters, just like Judeo-Arabic was a mixture of Arabic and Hebrew, written in Hebrew letters. So too Yiddish was a German dialect with a lot of loanwords from Hebrew, and that became the standard language of a good hefty portion of the Jews of Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, you may recall that during this period of time, there was also the Black Death. That was 1346, 1353. And there are differences of opinion as to how much Jews suffered from the Black Death. There's some who want to claim that for various Jewish practices, Jews did not suffer as much from the Black Death. Who knows? But certainly, if they didn't suffer as much from the Black Death, then they became suspect as to causing the Black Death. And so there were a lot of riots against Jews, accusing them of poisoning the wells, spreading the plague, and Jews were scapegoated. As a matter of fact, though, Pope Clement VI in 1348 issued 2 papal bulls which condemned the violence and said those who blamed the plague on Jews had been seduced by that liar, the devil. And he urged clergy to protect Jews as he had done. So, interestingly enough, we had a friend in Pope Clement VI, and the popes often protected the Jews. Indeed, often
during the Holocaust.
We're not talking about the Holocaust.
Okay, I was going to say that one was
talking about Middle Ages, and during the Holocaust there were some too. Don't paintbrush everybody. You know, and it's a subject of immense debate as to the role of the Pope during the Holocaust. Whether or not he could have done more, should have done more. Everybody should have done more. There's no question about that. His role is though subject to great debate. Something that is interesting to note, you know, Jewish populations grow, shrink, result of births, immigration, catastrophes, calamities, wars, plagues. There was some genetic testing done on Ashkenazic Jews that points to a very steep decline in the Jewish population of those who are descended from these original Ashkenazic Jews, down to as few as, according to some, as 250 to 420 people were all that constituted the Jews of Ashkenaz around the 1350s. Eventually, they expanded to be over the millions of Jews in Eastern Europe. But at that time, they really shrunk in terms of their numbers. Whether or not that's an accurate number, I don't know. All right, I'm going to turn to, Spain had been this vital, important center of Jewish life, mostly under the rule of the Muslims. But as the Christians more and more took over Spain and pushed the Muslims out of Spain, they introduced a lot of pressure on Jews to convert to Christianity. We know that the Jewish community of Spain was relatively well-to-do. There were important advisors to both Muslim and Christian kings. We have a rich heritage of publication or manuscripts from that era. But as the vise tightened, it's unclear how many Jews accepted Christianity willingly, willingly under the circumstances. We do know there's a substantial number that did, but they usually maintained their connections with their Jewish relatives. And so they were always suspect of not being good Christians, or they were often called Judaizers. They're trying to Judaize Christianity. And as Ferdinand and Isabella marched through Spain and finally conquered Granada, they increased this pressure. And so in 1492, all Jews are expelled from Spain. So some 200,000 Jews leave. We don't know how many stayed behind. We don't know how many had converted earlier, not so willingly perhaps, are not so necessarily so good. But it was a catastrophe for the Jewish world. The Spanish expulsion had a huge impact on Spanish Jewry. First of all, of course, being expelled from where you live for all those years, those centuries, an increased sense of exile that plays out a lot in the mystical world. Just briefly, one of the elements of mysticism talks about the divine presence, the Shekhinah, which also is understood as being, in quotations, the feminine element of God, as it were. Okay, the divine presence, and the Shekhinah goes into exile when Israel goes into exile, and when the Jews get expelled from Spain, the Shekhinah goes with them again into another exile. And with this emphasis on the Shekhinah and the relationship of the divine, we'll have to talk about in Kabbalah because it's not my thing, but is this idea of God's two aspects and coming back together and restoring from the diaspora. All of these impact the rabbis who originally come from Spain and part of this mystical circle of Joseph Cairo and the Ariya Kodesh and others who settle in Sfat. But Gerush Sfarad, as it's called in Hebrew, the expulsion from Spain, certainly had this tremendous impact. For some parts of the world, it was very good. What was it? Caliph? I don't know. The Turkish ruler, I forget what if he was called a caliph at that time or not, invited Jews to come settle there. Some Jews settled in Poland. We have Jews who settled in Amsterdam. We have Jews who eventually settled in Brazil and then eventually make their way to New York. Well, in those days, New Amsterdam. But it was a very harsh time. Now, some Jews who converted secretly practiced Judaism. We know that. They were called Marranos, which means pigs, by the locals. And when Isabel and Ferdinand and Isabella call in the Inquisition to Spain, theoretically, they only had power over Christians. The Inquisition never had power over Jews who had never converted to Christianity. People, you have to understand that. It's only if you had converted that the Inquisition would have power over you. Now, what happens? You have a lot of conversos, as they're called, new Christians, who, one, are not necessarily very well educated in Christian practice. There's a famous story about a man who's pushed to convert and is pushed to convert, and one day he comes home to his wife, and it's right after Passover, and he says, "No more Passover for us. I've converted. I'm now a good Christian." She said, "Couldn't you do it before Passover?" Right? But who knows? So a lot of them were ignorant, and some of them fell prey to the Inquisition because they didn't know better. They didn't know what to do, or they were used to, we don't eat pork. What can I tell you? I don't eat pork, but that's a Judaizing, because Jews don't eat pork. Good Christians eat pork. So you have that aspect of it. Then you also have the aspect that a number of these conversos were wealthy. And they were kind of brought into the aristocracy of Spanish society. Well, if you turn somebody over to the Inquisition for heresy, you could get some of their money. And so some people were turned over to the Inquisition simply because the people who are turning them over were jealous of their possessions. And the Inquisition doesn't say, put your hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help you God. It tortures you. Because after all, torture is the only way that you can really find the truth. And of course, when you're being tortured, you'll accuse everybody of misbehavior. And this attitude, this reality existed up until the modern era. We know that there are communities in Mexico, in southern United States, in the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area, who have Jewish practices, who have not married generally outside of their own communities. They don't know anything about Judaism, but they clearly have practices that go back to their having been secret Jews. And they're still secretive about it and don't like talking about it. They know you don't share this with anybody. And so there have been some attempts to kind of reach out to some of these crypto Jews to bring them back to Judaism. I don't know where anything's really coming from, but that's the reality. Okay. So with the expulsion of Spain, we have, as I said, some go to the Netherlands, Turkey, Arab lands, Judea. Some make it to South and Central America. Many immigrate to Poland. And in later centuries, more than 50% of Jewish world population lived in Poland. Right? So now the center of gravity of Jewish population shifts to Eastern Europe, especially to Poland. Right? But there are still Jews in other parts of the world. In 1516, the first ghetto of Venice was established. We're not sure what the word ghetto means exactly. Some say it has to do with cannon, a cannon factory that was there. But Jews were forced to live in that area. Many, throughout Jewish history, Jews tended to live in the same neighborhood. After all, it's convenient. Synagogues, other people, what have you. But some were outliers. Some lived out in other places. But now you begin to have ghettos coming into being. And sometimes the ghettos would even have walls and gates. And Jews were not allowed outside the walls. And the gates were shut at night to prevent Jews from going back and forth in Christian areas. Now, around this time, and we know that the Shulchan Aruch is published in 15. What's the date? Oh, I don't have it written down here. I have it somewhere else. 1570, yeah. In 1570, the Shulchan Aruch is written and published. And not only is it published, well, first of all, two things happen. One, Yosef Karo, who's a Sephardic authority, very famous, very important Sephardic authority. We've talked about this before. He publishes this. Then Rabbi Moses Easterlitz, a very important, significant rabbinic figure in Poland, in Krakow, I believe, he writes super commentaries that were on the Shulchan Aruch, the mappa, the tablecloth for the set table. Shulchan Aruch means a set table, mappa means a tablecloth. And the two of them get printed together. And the power of the printing press makes this work become widespread throughout the Jewish world and the most influential law code of Jewish history. Even more, although Maimonides has an important element, the people go to the Shulchan Aruch in most of the Jewish world. They don't necessarily go to Maimonides except a curiosity for something, or they're studying something in Talmud, want to know what Maimonides had to say on that sort of thing. So the existence of the printing press had a heavy impact on the Jewish world. One, through this. Secondarily, later on, we know when the Talmud is printed by a non-Jewish printer in Italy, it enables Jews throughout the world to have copies of the Talmud. Up until then, people had manuscripts. Some people might have a few volumes of the Talmud as manuscripts, maybe as a handwritten work, but it was not, it was not known for people to have copies of the Talmud. With the printing press, you begin to have an expansion of Jewish knowledge, Jewish understanding, and it creates a whole new aspect to Jewish study, the availability of Jewish books. We'll talk about the Ari, Isaac Luria later on, about Kabbalah. We're almost on the borders of the modern era. And the 17th century, the 1600s, was a time of great financial difficulty for many Jews in Eastern Europe. There was predictions of the coming of the Messiah around this time. And very famously, a man by the name of Shabtai Tzvi, who lived 1626 to 1676, was proclaimed by a fellow as being the Messiah. And thus began the Sabbatean movement. It is still a bone of contention as to how many Jews believed that he really was the Messiah. It's not at all clear. There certainly were large numbers. There were Jews who sold all their property and packed their bags, expecting to go to the land of Israel any day shortly. And as Shabtai Tzvi gained influence, he also began to do some not quite so normative practices. So there were some Jews who opposed him, but a good part of the Jewish community thought he was the Messiah. But he ends up in Turkey, and he is taken before the Caliph, and he's given a choice: convert to Islam or die. And he decides the better part of valor is to convert to Islam. So now you have a lot of followers who are left with a problem. And we find this many times in human history when you have a charismatic leader of a group and he does something wrong, or he dies, or something happens. What does the group do as a result of that? They were expecting him to create nirvana or create the age of the Messiah, whatever it may be. And now they're let down. So there are different reactions. One reaction is say, shame on us. We got taken in. We're going to go back to our ways. It's not the Messiah. Forget it. A curse on his house. Okay. There are some who still believe he's the Messiah. And they say, well, this is part of the struggle that takes place bringing about the Messianic era. And one of the things that influenced this whole flow of things was the spread of Kabbalah, of mysticism. And in the Kabbalistic notion at that time is the idea of redemption of the holy sparks. I say, I'll explain it more when we get to Kabbalah, but just shortly, there are shards, sparks. There are sparks that come from the divine that got captured by these pieces of sphirot that were crushed in the act of creation. I know you don't understand what I'm talking about, but when you do a mitzvah with the right intent, right kavanah, you can release some of those sparks so they rise back up to heaven. It helps bring the coming of the Messiah closer. Okay, that's an idea, and that's a very powerful idea, which we'll talk about, I say, later on. Now, according to some klipot, or some sparks, are really down in the depths. They're so far down that you have to commit a sin in order to get that far down, in order to release the spark so it can go up to heaven. Don't say it makes sense to me, but that's the idea. Okay. So now, in order to release some of these sparks, some said the Mashiach, the Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, he had to become an apostate so that he could go down to the depths and release those sparks. We, on the other hand, just have to wait. Wait to see, when he's finished, then he'll come back and everything will be hunky-dory. That's an old Talmudic expression, hunky-dory. Okay. Others said, no, wait a minute. We too have to follow the path of the Messiah. If we want to really bring redemption, we have to emulate what he did. And so there's a group in Turkey known as the Donme who convert to Islam, but practice Judaism in secret, only marry each other, and maintain that they're helping to bring about the redemption. There may even be a few left around in Turkey today. Now, in Austria, there are some followers who end up following one of his converts. I'm running a blank at the moment. Why don't I remember his name? Oh, come on. Jacob Frank. Okay. I had a blank there. Oh, get older, you lose some of your rememberings. I found out that my brain actually has shrunk a teeny tiny bit. I was tested. I had they looked for my brain in a scan for something because I fell the other day. And yeah, there's some normal age shrinkage. Yeah, nothing to worry about. It's normal. But I blame anything I forget because it was in that part of the brain that used to be there. Okay. Now, one of the normal things that happens when there's a sectarian group if the mainstream calls them heretics, right? So they're heretics. And heretics always do bad things, especially sexually bad things. They're known for always doing that. So if you have a sectarian group, you know they're going to be sexually immodest, sexually improprious, swapping wives and husbands, multiple things, all kinds of not nice things. Okay, it's always the accusation that people use. So, when I was a student in the seminary, I had to write a paper on some of the anti-Hasidic diatribes, and that they too accused the Hasidim of misbehavior in that realm. Okay, so Jacob Frank was accused of these kinds of things. The difference is it was true. It's not simply that he was just being accused, he's this crazy guy, and so we're maligning him and saying he was guilty of sexual orgies and wife swapping and all those kinds of things. He was, because that was part of the vision. If you have to go down to the depths to raise up the sparks, what better way than to violate sexual taboos? And so he was known to have done that. Converts to Catholicism, practices his secret cabal, and has his followers. Fortunately, they disappear from the scene. But that was their way. So you have those who fell for Shabtai Tzvi and said, "Oy, we made a mistake. Shame on us." You had those who fell for Shabtai Tzvi and said, "We're still his followers, and we'll wait to what happens." And most of that just disappears eventually in the course of time, both of those camps. And then you have the camp that says we have to emulate the Messiah, ending up in groups like the Doma and the Frankists. Now, you also had another group who never believed in Shabtai Tzvi and were extremely anti-Shabtai Tzvi. And they wrote works and accused some of the rabbis of their era of being secret Sabbateans. So there's a very famous dispute between Rabbi Eibeshitz and another rabbi, Chacham Tzvi's son, not Alkabetz, Yavitz, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. And Yavitz, who was not a rabbi, an official rabbi, he was a scholar and had a printing press and was a very important figure. He accuses Rabbi Eibeshitz of being a secret Sabbatean, that he wrote amulets, protective amulets that had Sabbatean messages in them. It was a really big fight, real cause célèbre. Okay, so that's going on in this century. To make life even more difficult, one of the calculations for the coming of the Messiah said it was going to be around the year 1648. I don't know where that came from, but they thought it was going to be around 1648. And first of all, now, according to at least my sources, the Jewish population in 1648 was approximately 450,000, which was about 40% of the total Polish population. Bohemia had some 40,000, Moravia had 25,000. The worldwide population of Jewry, at least according to this, is said to be 750,000. I think that's got to be too low. But anyway, all right. So now, 1648, we're waiting for the Messiah. Shabtai Tzvi comes along. He's one of the ones who takes advantage of that. But there's a Ukrainian Cossack by the name of Bogdan Kamenicki. Now, if you know any of your history of that part of the world, the Polish nobility was mostly Roman Catholic. The Ukrainian peasants were Eastern Orthodox. They were serfs. The large land holdings were in the hands of these Catholic Polish nobility. They often hired Jewish individuals to manage their estates. And these Jewish managers thus became the go-between between the landowners and the peasants. And it's never good to get in the middle like that. And so in 1648 through 1655, a Ukrainian Cossack, as Bohdan Kamenicki, led an uprising against the Polish gentry and against the Jews because they were seen as being in cahoots with the Polish gentry. By the way, Cossack is not really a group of people, an ethnic identity. It's just it's sort of like Vikings. They're not necessarily an identity of an ethnic group. It's people who went to Viking, went to fight, went to raid. Because apparently there were a few Jewish Cossacks in history. So anyway, Khmelnytsky massacred, some say as many as 5,000 Jews during this period of time, and a similar number of the gentry. And the total decrease in the number of Jews is estimated at 100,000 Jews died during that time. All right. Furthermore, as a little bit of ray of sunshine, in 1655, the Jews are readmitted to England by Oliver Cromwell. All right, so now you've had a really bad century. You've had false messiahs, you've had massacres, you have had disputes. Jewish society at that time, like every society, has its wealthy, had its poor. It also had a very strong scholarly class, which of course was open to everyone. To be a scholar, Talmid Chacham, you didn't have to be wealthy, you didn't have to be poor, you didn't have to be middle class. If you could do it, you did it. But there were a couple of things that were going on. One of them was that, at least according to some, the style of Jewish scholarship had gotten very pilpulistic, very dry, very difficult for the average individual. And to really get a reputation as a great scholar was not so simple. If the status card in the Jewish community was how much Torah you knew, that means the greater the scholar, Torah scholar, the greater your status. So the wealthy merchants, whatever they were, often married their daughters to young scholars and sometimes helped pay for them to study, to learn. And so there was kind of this little bit of a mingling between the rabbinic segment and the wealthy segment that was suspicious in some people's eyes. After all, the rabbis were the judges. They were the ones who decided court matters and things, legal matters. And the lower class, the poorer Jews who, they learned a little bit, they learned Chumash and Rashi, the men at least, but they weren't great scholars. And if the height of Judaism is scholarship, you're nothing. You can't climb those heights. That's the background for the beginning of the Hasidic movement. Now, a man by the name of Israel ben Eliezer, who was known as the Baal Shem Tov, he was born in 1700, dies in 1760. He founded what became known as Hasidic Judaism, a way to approach God through meditation and fervent joy. So he attracted a following that emphasized joy, emphasized singing, emphasized that the way to God was through prayer and through song and rejoicing, not necessarily through scholarship. And some of the later Hasidim were even anti-scholar. Anybody could achieve this. You didn't have to be a Talmid Chacham, a great scholar, in order to be this kind of a person, a pious Jew, a chassid. Now, Chassidut has at its center also the idea that you attach yourself to a tzaddik, somebody who is a really righteous individual. And it serves as the intermediary between you and God, as it were. And so a lot of charismatic figures got attracted to the Hasidic movement. They introduced certain changes in the liturgy because of their Kabbalistic leanings. We'll talk more when we talk about Kabbalah. They were opposed by some. Those who opposed them were known as the opposers in English. In the Eastern European dialect, misnagdim, those against, the opposed, mitnagdim in the modern Hebrew pronunciation. And there was bitter enmity between the two camps. And there were cases where the authorities, the Jewish authorities, would inform the non-Jewish authorities, claiming that these rabble-rousers, these Hasidic sherebbes, were cheating people, or they were doing this or that wrong. Some of them were charlatans. Some of them got great amounts of money from their followers and lived in wonderful places. But they said that's because they are the tzaddik and they represent the people. They should be in a place like that. Okay? So that took place. And I remember I said, when I was a student at the seminary back in the Dark Ages, I read one of these anti-Hasidic polemics, which accused them of doing all kinds of things against Jewish law. For example, one of the things that's very clearly known in Hasidic circles is they're not very careful about the times for prayer, when you're supposed to pray. And it's not a joke that people in Israel are coming back from the Kotel HaMaravi for evening prayers on Friday night. They've done mincha, they've done the evening service, they're on their way home, it's almost pitch black out, and the Hasidim are going down to the wall to do mincha, the afternoon service. Okay? It's a very well-known phenomenon. They got their base on it. That's not neither here nor there, but so there was a lot of back and forth fighting. The various Hasidic groups divide up into eventually different rebbes who are their leaders. They usually become inherited roles, a dynasty, Hasidic dynasty. And some of them, like Lubavitch, the Lubavitch Rebbe, the last one anyway, because they haven't replaced him, are all related to the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay. Now, at the same time, you had one of the greatest Jewish minds, perhaps since Moses Maimonides, or even as great as Maimonides, and that was the Vilna Gaon, Elijah of Vilna. And the way that things worked in those, he was called a Gaon as a compliment, and it's often used that way today, very, very freely. But Gaon meant he was really a great scholar, and he was one of the greatest minds that the Jewish world ever produced, was conversant in all areas of Jewish knowledge, did not write very much, and what he does write is often very difficult to understand and completely, but he was paid his life, livelihood, his expenses were paid for by the Jewish community of Vilna. He didn't have to work for anything. All he had to do was sit and learn. And he taught some disciples, and some of them became very famous afterwards. And some of them, such as the group that eventually gave rise to the Soloveitchiks, were well known, and the Brisker Rav, and all kinds of things like that. And he was interesting because he was also, He was a forerunner, I would say, of modern critical study. He wasn't a modern critic, but he was very concerned about studying the Talmud on a critical basis, i.e. understanding the various manuscripts and the mistakes that crept in and that sort of thing. And that gave rise to academic scholarship today often owes a lot to the Vilna Gaon. He was opposed to the Hasidim. There are all kinds of things. There's a famous statement, whether it's true or false, the Hasidim danced on his grave. He did sign some anti-Hasidic documents, but who knows if he even understood what he was signing because people came to him to do it. But we're going to have to stop here because it's now after 9 o'clock. And so we're just entering into the 18th century. We've had the introduction of Hasidim, we mentioned Vilna Gaon. We're going to talk about Moses Mendelssohn next week and also the beginnings of Reformed Jewish history up to Israel, okay? Any questions on what I did tonight? I don't expect you to remember all the ins and outs and details. It's more for general oversight for you. It'd be nice if you could, but I want you to understand the flow of Jewish history. I mentioned, I skipped a lot of them. There are a lot of things about this date Jews get expelled from this community, and this date they get expelled from another community. And the modern scholars talk about what they call the lachrymose history of Judaism. Everything was bad. No, most of the time it was good, or most of the time at least it was decent. Yeah, there were bad times, but there were more good times than bad times. So it shouldn't be seen as, every day as Jews are wandering the world, not knowing where their next food is going to come from. But it was there. And up until now, until this period of time, the beginning of the 18th century, Jews are not citizens of the lands in which they live. That's important to note. The Jews constitute a separate group within the body politic of all of these different countries. It's with the French Revolution and the Napoleon Bonaparte's conquest of Europe that Jews begin to become citizens. So that's an element because we're going to talk about leading up to the Holocaust. So this will help lead us up into the Holocaust, the continuation of this, okay?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's been very interesting.
Good. All right, so please God, we'll see everybody next week. And